Women are not secondary players in human destiny, and society has always known that.
Unless we get this structural reform, we're always going to have torment of powerlessness.
Equality means that some of those ill-gotten gains must be given up.
Consciousness is an intellectual illusion.
Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Capital and Ideology. My name is Richard Holden and I'm a Professor of Economics here at UNSW Sydney. Tonight's event is presented by the UNSW Centre for Ideas and we're thrilled to be joined by esteemed economist Tomar Piketty. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Bidjigal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders both past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. To join the digital conversation during tonight's event, please comment on Facebook, use the live chat on YouTube, or send us a tweet. And don't forget to use the hashtag UNSWIdeas. I'd now like to welcome Tomar Piketty, who is a leading French economist, an economist in general, and Professor of Economics at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences at the Paris School of Economics. He is the co-director of the World Inequality Lab and the World Inequality Database. Professor Piketty is author of research articles published in such leading journals as the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Political Economy, the American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, Explorations in Economic History, Annales Histoire Sciences Sociales, and of a dozen books, including the critically acclaimed and internationally best-selling Capital in the 21st Century, and the book we're discussing today, Capital and Ideology. Professor Piketty, welcome.
Hello.
Now, Capital in the 21st Century, I think most people would agree, was very ambitious and incredibly influential. My reading is that Capital and Ideology is, if possible, perhaps even more ambitious. Of course, in Capital in the 21st Century, you argued that if the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of growth in the economy, then inequality will rise more or less inexorably. It seems to me that Capital and Ideology deals with how that rate of return on capital and the rate of growth are determined by other factors, or I guess, as economists, we'd say are endogenous, what they depend on and why they depend on it. And in particular, you discuss interactions between social groups. And here's, I guess, where the ambition comes in. It can explain slavery, serfdom, colonialism, communism, and what you call hypercapitalism. So a pretty ambitious agenda for anyone, even perhaps yourself, to write. Let me start by asking you this. One of the things that strikes many people who've read this book and your previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, is the amazing data that you've assembled. It's very long run, it's novel, it seems very hard to construct, nobody ever did it before. Paul Krugman, in his review of this book in the New York Times, comments on that. I think Larry Summers said that in Capital in the 21st Century, the data construction exercise was in and of itself worthy of a Nobel Prize, which is pretty high praise from Larry, as you well know. It's kind of unusual for what one might call a conventionally trained economist to undertake such a big data collection and assembly exercise. What led you to pursue this agenda in the first place?
Well, first of all, I don't, let me stress that, I don't have a strong identity as an economist. I view my work more as the work of a social scientist. I think the boundaries between economics, history, political science, sociology are much less clear than what economists sometimes pretend, or historians sometimes pretend. People like to draw strong boundaries, but in my area of investigation, which is, the history of the distribution of income and wealth and equality and inequality across societies, I think we have to be very open-minded in terms of methodology, data sources. We have to look we have to use quantitative data, of course, when we have it. But we are not going to be able to have the kind of theoretical modeling or econometric identification that economists are sometimes very obsessed with, because we are not going to rewrite the history of the 20th century without World War I and World War II and progressive taxation and social security system. So we have to rely on methods and modes of inference, which in a way are closer to what historians or political scientists are doing. So in any case, I try not to lose too much time about conflict over boundaries, and I'm trying to pursue my work. So regarding this new book, Capital and Ideology, I think it's better than the previous one. I think I'm making progress, but it's still very imperfect. I should say, it's an ambitious book, but it's not that, I'm just trying to accumulate work and evidence, and, I'm trying to be humble about how much I've been able to achieve so far. I think this book has many imperfections, and I welcome, all comments and suggestions for, research that I may not have read, and new work that I will read. And so in this, as compared to the previous book, I guess this new book has two main advantages. One is that I go much beyond the Western world than I did in my previous book. So, we've made progress in collecting data, in Africa, in India, in Latin America, in China, in colonial societies. So the entire, colonial, post-colonial perspective plays a much bigger role in this new book, because I have done more research on this. I have made progress in my understanding of how important this is to understand today's inequality structure, both within countries and, of course, between countries at the international level. So that's the first main novelty, is really to go beyond the sort of very much Western-centered perspectives that I had in Capital in the 21st century. And the second big addition is to put emphasis on politics and ideology, indeed, as the primary determinant of levels of equality and inequality, which is something that was already present in Capital in the 21st century, in the sense that I talk a lot about the invention of progressive taxation during the 20th century, and how Western societies, especially after World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, transformed their institutions and their social system and fiscal and legal system. But in this new book, I take these issues much more in a much more central manner, but there will be other books, and the kind of discussion we have today, to me, this is the way to make progress, to realize also all the limitations of what I've done, and to try to respond to the limitations in the future works that I will be doing, and that we are already doing. The World Inequality Database, I should say, is a very collective project. We have over 100 researchers across the world that have been involved, and we're putting new data almost every day. And we're going to publish a new World Inequality Report 2022 at the beginning of next year. And we are publishing a book next month in France, and in September in English at Harvard University Press, on a new world political cleavage and inequality database, where we have now more than 50 electoral democracies, where we look at how voting pattern by income, group, wealth, education, gender, religion have changed since between 1948 and 2020, because this is the period of time for which we have post-electoral survey in most of these countries. So that's again a very sort of systematic world database kind of exercise, and we give interpretation for what we find, of course, but as usual, I'm not trying to impose one interpretation. Of course, I give the interpretation which I feel is the most plausible given the research that I have and the data that I have. But if other people come with other interpretation, alternative interpretation, bring their own thinking, new data to the data that I'm bringing, I have of course no problem with this. That's democratic conversation and discussion.
Well, thank you for giving us a sneak peek of your forthcoming work. You're so productive, and we'll try and keep up. Ideology is obviously completely central to this work. Can you explain to us a little bit of how your view of an ideology comes to dominate?
Well, that's a big and complicated question, and I don't pretend I have a complete theory for this. Let me first say that in my view and in this book, ideology is not something negative, because sometimes we use ideology by saying, oh, it's so ideological, which means he's not really thinking about the facts and etc. This is of course a very fact-driven book. But I think, ideologies will always be there because the questions that we're trying to solve are so complicated that, even with perfect data, perfect historical evidence, there will be always different opinions. So in my view, there are two main areas of conflict, ideological conflict. There's how you organize property relations. So this is the question of property in general, and how you organize the frontier system, the question of borders, the questions of, what is the political community to which you identify, how do you organize this political community, how do you organize its relation with other political communities through a federation, through an empire, through colonies, through what's your migration policy. So the property question is also very broad. The property question is, what can we own? So, over time, you see different societies where it was possible to own slaves, where it was possible to own pretty much anything. Today, we have a lot of discussion. Should we be able to own knowledge? What are the limits to that? And what are the relation between owners of capital and workers? What are the legal rights? What is the governance system in companies? So these two broad set of questions, of course, come with other questions, the fiscal system, the educational system, which are related in some way to the issue of property formation. And I view, an ideology as a sort of set of answers to the question about what's the most socially desirable way to organize a property system, a frontier system. And societies and each individual within a given society, in a way are trying to learn. So what are they learning from, and how do they develop their own ideology? It depends on each individual. It can be through your friends, through your books, through your socialization experience, through your political party, your trade union, your church, your whatever. And at a broader level, I think societies learn also from their own historical trajectory. So if you take like an event like the French Revolution, which is a time of crisis where clearly there's a lot of anger against the inequality, the fact that aristocrats have big legal privileges, that the church has a lot of property, which in principle is supposed to come in the Ancien Régime society with some counterpart in terms of education, in terms of protection, safety. People feel that this, in the end, they don't really get the counterpart that will justify the kind of inequality that they perceived at the time. You have the French Revolution. Then you have, a whole set of possible trajectories that can happen depending on the thinking and the concept and the program and the platforms that were sort of discussed before, but also through some level of improvisation, like in all political crises, like today with the epidemic, we are trying to invent new way to solve new problem. And then after these events, there will be a memory of, say, what went wrong and what went right during the French Revolution, which people will use in order to found the Third Republic in a certain way, in order to develop. So societies are trying to learn from their experience with their political system, with the taxation system, with their education system. Sometimes they're also trying to learn from other countries, but unfortunately, they don't do it a lot. That's one of my, in a way, my main enemy is intellectual nationalism and nationalism in general. The fact that we we look mostly at our own history. We feel we are unique. And, of course, every country, every society is unique and exceptional in a certain way. But at the same time, we always have a lot to learn by comparing, our experience with the tax system used in other countries, the education system used in other countries, the electoral system. Australia has been innovative in this dimension. Every country has been innovative in many dimensions, and so that's where the process of ideological formation could be improved, and this is also where social scientists can play a little role by trying to put in a book all this different experience, because people forget, they don't look at other countries, and they also have sometimes limited memory. So just to take an example, which of course I plays an important role in my thinking, many people, in the US or across the world have completely forgotten that, between 1930 and 1980, the top income tax rate in the United States was 81% on average. During half a century, sometimes it was 91, sometimes 70. On average, it was 81% during half a century. And, apparently US capitalism did not disappear, otherwise we would have noticed it. And if anything, the rates of productivity growth, which is, the best measure of innovation that we have, were much bigger, for instance, between 1950 and 1980, than what they have been since the 1980s after top income tax rate were divided by 2. I'm not saying this ends the discussion, but this is typically the kind of historical perspective which is relatively simple, but which people tend to forget. And my experience is that when even this now begins to be well known, but not so much. You hear people, in particular in the business world, who say, "Oh, but this has never happened. This never worked. This is the Soviet Union." And you tell them, "Well, no, this is the United States of America." But people stop listening. When it comes to money matters, and especially taxation, people have very strong views. Sometimes they also have very strong interest, but I think they also have strong views. And so, I try in my book to take ideologies seriously, because I think it's always more than just the mechanical expression of different interests. It's always different views of the world, which people are partly sincere about, are serious, and that's what makes that's what makes democracy worthwhile. Also, is that people are to a large extent try to put forward, view of the world. No rich people in the world would say, cut my tax because I want to be richer and the poor to be poorer. He will never say that. He will always say, cut my tax because in the end, there will be more innovation. It will be better for the poor. And, maybe it's partly hypocritical sometimes, but at least there needs to be some plausibility to what he says. And everybody needs to put some plausible ideology, some plausible narrative on the table. And this is this confrontation of plausible narrative, which I find interesting to analyze. And even though, at the end, I'm not trying just to distance myself from every ideology. I take position at the end of my book and throughout the book, because I think it's too easy for social scientists just to step aside and to say, okay, I don't take stand, So I'm part of the discussion, and but I always try to make it in a way, to clarify, what is the evidence which I feel, in my view, is convincing, and of course, I leave the discussion open for the future.
Well, it's nice of you to mention the Australian electoral system. It's ranked choice voting and compulsory voting are something that we think are good features. And a number of us are trying to convince people in the United States and other places that it's a good idea, but we'll see how we go with that. Now, obviously, hypercapitalism is, I think it's your term and a new term, and that it's something that sounds bad. If ideology doesn't necessarily sound negative, hypercapitalism doesn't sound quite so good. Of course, your solution is participatory socialism. I wonder if you could explain what really is participatory socialism, and perhaps you could compare and contrast it with, say, democratic socialism that's been espoused by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or, say, Elizabeth Warren or perhaps Bernie Sanders in the United States context?
Okay, so the system of participatory socialism that I described at the end of my book is, is based on a number of pillars about, educational justice, taxation, basic income. But there are really two main pillars which I want to mention now, which are really about the redefinition of the property system and the regulation of property in general. These two pillars are first co-management, which means more workers' rights in companies, and the second pillar is a permanent circulation of property through universal capital endowment, so sort of minimum inheritance for all, financed by progressive taxation of wealth and inheritance. So first, about the first pillar. As you know, there's a number of countries during the 20th century, in particular Germany, Sweden, and pretty much all Nordic countries in Europe, which introduced very substantial voting rights for workers in companies. So this is pretty substantial in the sense that in Germany, for instance, in large companies, it is actually 50% of voting rights in the board of large companies, which go to worker representative elected by worker representative and typically trade union members, but it can be any worker which wins the election in this worker representative election. Now, it's 50% minus one in the sense that shareholders have the decisive vote, but still it means that this 50% minus one of voting rights come without any capital share. So you don't need to have a capital share in the company to get that. If in addition, workers own 10 or 20% of the capital of the company, then they will get 10 or 20% of the 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, in addition to their 50% of voting rights as workers. Therefore, they will get majority control of the company, which is already quite a different system of capitalism in general than what we are accustomed to in France or in Australia or in the US, because actually these reforms have never been extended beyond Germany and Sweden and Nordic European countries, basically. And they've been in place for a long time, since the 1950s. And in the end, I think it worked pretty well. And why did it work pretty well? Well, first, shareholders, of course, in Germany did not want that at all. When it happened, it happened through a very different balance of power in post-World War II Germany. I'm not going to describe the entire story, but it was a major change. And the constitution of Germany in 1949 had to be written, and actually the Constitution of Germany of 1919 already was describing property as a notion involving different group of stakeholders, not only as pure private property, but as a social property involving workers, involving land users, involving not only property owners. And this is also what made possible to the law of 1952 in Germany to distribute all these voting rights. So I think it worked pretty well because in the end it allowed to involve workers in the definition of the long-run strategy of company, which was good, in fact, for overall productivity and cohesion. And I think in some way workers are the main investors of company because they invest skills, they invest sometimes skills that are company specific in the sense that you learn to work in a certain way for Volkswagen or for another company, and that's not, if you get fired right away, you're not going to be able to use these skills quite as well in another company. So you are the real long-run investors of company in a much more real way than short-run speculators on the stock market. So there are lots of good theoretical reasons, and in practice, I think it worked pretty well. So the first pillar of participatory socialism is just to extend this system to other countries, but also to extend it so first to small companies, not only to large companies. So in Sweden, it actually applies to relatively small companies. In Germany, it's mostly to large companies. So that's the first extension I discussed. The other extension I discussed is that within the 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, you could have a limitation, a cap on the maximum number of votes that a single shareholder can have, at least in very large company. So, I discuss formula in my book. It could be that in a very small company, less than 10 workers, a single shareholder can have 90% of the vote, of the 50% of the vote going to shareholders. But if you have more than 100 workers, it could be capped to 10%. The general idea is that we live in very complex societies with very educated workforce, and the idea is that one individual is able to take all decision on his own in a very large companies, makes no sense at all. It is a kind of application of a sort of monarchical principle to the economy, which I find completely out of date, with the reality of our society. So on the basis of this historical experience, I try to extend the system, and this is the first pillar. The second pillar of participatory socialism is to redistribute wealth itself, because even with in my system that I first described, you still have private property. Of course, you have voting rights. If you create a small companies, and you are also a wage earner in your company, you will participate also to the voting rights going to the wage earner. So you will have control of the company. As the company gets bigger, you will have to discuss with other workers, make coalition, but still you will have more power than if you're not shareholder. So you still have private property in a clear way. I think we also need the second pillar. We also need to redistribute property itself. We live in societies where the bottom 50% of the population in a country like Australia or France, for that matter, owns less than 5% of total wealth. So if you look at total wealth, in Australia, real estate, business, financial assets, everything, the bottom 50% is going to own maybe 5%, whereas the top 10% will own 50 or 60% or more. So basically, this means that half of the population, in particular, or actually almost 2/3 of the population, do not inherit any wealth, which limits their possibility to create a company, to buy a home. You have extremely concentrated inherited wealth, which is a major deviation from the theoretical principle of equal opportunity, which people, everybody pretends to be in favor of equal opportunity, but then when it comes to practical implementation, in particular with inheritance, then, people say, well, maybe. So what I'm proposing, I'm giving numbers, but, just for illustrative purposes, is to have a system where everybody at age 25 will receive a minimum inheritance, which in my example, I set to 120,000 euros, which in France, this is 60% of average per adult wealth. In Australia, it will not be very different, if you make the conversion. And that will be paid for by a mixture of progressive taxation of higher inheritance and also progressive taxation of annual wealth. This is not a radical proposal in the sense that in the numerical example I give, okay, people who today receive zero would receive 120,000. People who today receive 1 million euro, after the progressive tax and everything, they will still receive 600,000. So it's still a lot of inequality of opportunity. And if you want my opinion, we could go further than this. But so, this is up for discussion. So basically, these are the two pillars of participatory socialism. As compared to what Elizabeth Warren or other US political actors talking about democratic socialism are describing, I think there's a lot in common. I don't think they articulate as explicitly as I do either the long-run target in terms of voting system in companies or the permanent redistribution of wealth. Like, for instance, the wealth tax proposal that was made by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders during the campaign last year, which was very interesting. They proposed a top tax rate of up to 8% per year on billionaires, which is, 3 times more than any wealth tax that has been experimented in Europe in the past. So, the fact that a US candidate to US presidential election makes such a proposal and gets so much support, almost 50% of the vote for Sanders and Warren, and a vast majority of the vote below age 40 or even below age 50. I think, and if you look at opinion polls, even Republican voters actually approve the idea of a billionaire tax. Now, the limitation in this proposal is that it's really only a system on billionaires. So, they start at $50 million and the top. And they don't change at all the property tax system, for instance, and which is a very unfair wealth tax. The property tax in the US or in France, or I know less well about Australia, but I guess it must be similar. It's a very unfair wealth tax in the sense that, if you own a house worth $300,000 and you have a mortgage of $290,000, you're not very rich, you're just trying to access property, and you're paying the same property tax as someone who has the same house of $300,000, but instead of having a mortgage, has a $3 million financial portfolio. And this is crazy, and there's no economic model or theory that would justify anything like this. And the reason it's like this is just that it was set up 200 years ago at a time where financial assets were not very important. And also because the ideology at the time was, there was no attempt to redistribute property in any way. It was very conservative. And so I think we should, ideally, we should rethink both the existing property tax and the billionaire tax into sort of some common unified progressive tax on net wealth, which then can also, together with the inheritance tax, finance this minimum inheritance for all. I'm not saying we are not playing the same game with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, as you noticed. I write books. They are candidates in election. I'm not saying that what I'm describing, participatory socialism, is going to happen next week, and that this is what they should propose to the electorate right away. I'm thinking about the long run. And I think it's also useful, sometimes to think about the long run and not only about next week. And if you look at the transformation that happened over the past 100 years, and you compare, the capitalism that we had in 1910, which was sort of very authoritarian, unequal, colonial, patriarchal, racist capitalism, 1910. France had a huge colonial empire, used the forced labors everywhere in its empire. Okay, that was capitalism, but it was a very specific form of colonial capitalism. And you compare to the kind of social democratic capitalism or social democratic societies that we have today, with 40% or 50% of national income going to social spending, education, etc., with much more legal rights for workers and consumers. It's a very, very different system. And I would say, the participatory socialism system that I'm describing, of course, it's different from social democratic capitalism that we have today, but I would say it's not more different to the system we have today, and the system we have today is different from the colonial capitalism of 1910. So in a way, this is very much in the continuation. It is in the same long-run evolution. I'm trying to learn from the successful experience of the 20th century in terms of reduction of inequality, in particular, co-management, workers' rights in Germany, Sweden, progressive taxation, in particular in the United States. I mentioned earlier, Roosevelt with 80% tax rate. So, I'm trying to take these two big blocks of co-management, progressive taxation, and try to push them further So it's, I'm not being very imaginative in a way. I'm just trying to look at what happened and see how this could
I think you're
continue.
underselling yourself a little bit there. I mean, maybe one way to think about it, at least one way I can understand it, is the idea of the inheritance, which is funded, by progressive taxation, which is fascinating. To me, rings a little bit of the capabilities approach of, say, Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, in terms of saying, I think more than what they say about access to core goods and income and so on, but saying perhaps access to a certain amount of wealth is really important to being able to be a fully participatory member of society and democracy. And that certainly strikes me as a new idea and an important one. Now, relatedly, you discuss how social democracy can be revived by refocusing on more populist economic policies, and in particular by winning back the working class. But I think that under President Obama, at least one view is that with the Affordable Care Act, something in the direction of universal healthcare, it's not as good as healthcare in Australia yet or Europe, but something in the direction of universal healthcare was put in place, and top tax rates went up, not to 91% or 81%, but they went up a meaningful amount in the context of modern America. But the white working class voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. So was it the case that the Democratic Party wasn't populist enough? And if that's your view, what should they do? Should they abandon free trade? Should they get tough on immigration? How is it that centre-left parties can cater for these two constituencies they have or are trying to seek? The working class, but also highly educated voters. Can a centre-left party do both, or do they have to pick and choose?
Well, you cannot get 80% of the vote, I think. So at some point, yes, you have, to some extent, you have to choose, how much you want to emphasize redistribution, for instance, redistribution of wealth and property and increasing bottom wages and rather than top wages. At some point, yes, you have to choose. And I think, in effect, center-left parties over time have chosen, the highest educated group as their central target. Or at least this is what we see in the pattern of who votes for them, at least in terms of education. In terms of income, that's what I show in my work on the changing structure of electorate, is that today we have a sort of a division between, what I call the Brahmin left and the merchant right. So, high education people voting more for the left, high income people voting more for the right, and these are partly the same people, but not exactly in practice, not the same jobs, not the same sectors of activity, and I think in the end the people at the bottom have felt abandoned by this new system of sort of multiple elite with one intellectual elite being attached to a party and a sort of economic or business elite attached to another party. And I think this has done a lot of harm. So, I mean, this was not planned. Nobody decided, okay, I'm going to abandon the working class. But in the end, there was a sequence of decision and which led us there. So, to answer your question, was Obama not ambitious enough in terms of redistribution? Well, yeah, I think he was clearly not ambitious enough. I'm not saying it's easy in his position, but the way he won the primary, in 2008 was very much by trying to take Clinton at the time, Hillary Clinton, on the right-hand side, in particular on the universal healthcare system, which himself described during the debate during the primary debate of 2008 as giving too much power to the government, being too much based on the government. You should, if you watch the TV debate again, that was. So okay, that was his way to win to try to make sure that nobody will be afraid by his proposal, and that was his tactic. But certainly, it was not it was not very much on the left. I think the wealth tax can be part of the proposal which managed to convince working class voters that there is an attempt to redistribute the gains from growth, but it will take a lot more than this, because it's a long-run process of political disaffiliation and reaffiliation, And unfortunately, this is not going to change easily. But I think the only possibility in the long run, if left parties want to regain confidence from working class voters and bottom 50% income voters and bottom 50% wealth voters, is to move in a much more ambitious direction in terms of redistribution and committed to improve the working condition and material life of this group. So this involves a lot more redistribution in terms of progressive taxation, more workers' rights, more equity in educational investment. Let's say, in my country, in France, it's a public system, but it's extremely elitist in the sense that you will spend, 3 times more per student in very elitist schools than what you do in basic, university and schools where typically more lower class children tend to go to. So it's very hypocritical, and this should be changed. You mentioned the issue of trade and migration. I think the problem is not to regulate more the movement of people, but the problem is to regulate more the movement of capital. So I think it's free capital flow without common taxation is a big problem and was a big mistake. I think we have created a system where we have in effect instituted a sort of quasi-sacralized right to first, you make a fortune by using the public infrastructure of your country, the educational system, and then you press a button and your wealth goes somewhere else and nobody can follow you and nobody can tax you. And then you tell the rest of the population, oh, too bad, we don't know where the wealth has gone. We're going to have to tax you guys because you cannot move. You are the immobile people, so let's tax you more and more. And then you're wondering why, these people are, a bit, feel that they are being mistreated. But, it's the entire thing. But the thing is that, this didn't come. There's nothing natural in the fact that you can do that, press on a button and nobody can follow you and follow your wealth. It was designed by a very sophisticated international legal system, and this can be redesigned. Except that you cannot wait for unanimity. At some point you have to act. Individual countries have to say, well, look, from now on, starting in 6 months, starting in 12 months, if you don't want to renegotiate with me the capital flow treaty and this and this international trade agreement, I'm going to impose sanctions, and if you don't give me the information we need in order to have a proper taxation. And, this is the same for, if you think of carbon taxation and environmental dumping or actually fiscal dumping, you cannot trade with a country that has no taxation of carbon emission or no taxation of corporate profits in the same way as with a country that has the same level of carbon taxation and taxation of corporate profit as you do. So you have to put, some correction. Yeah. And, you cannot wait for world unanimity to set up this rule and, the World Trade Organization to set up these rules for everybody, because we know this is not going to happen. So it's very hypocrite. All the politicians who say, oh, yes, we're going to discuss this in the next international forum or whatever. At some point, this gave a lot of leverage to people like Donald Trump, who of course attacked the world trade system and the world economic system from a purely nationalist viewpoint. So without universalist objective about reducing inequality, fighting climate change, of course, was not his main problem in life. So, he attacked the world trade system and the world economic system through a pure nationalist angle. But I think this is partly the fault of, the left parties, which did not transform the international economic system from a more redistributive and universalist angle.
Well, on that very point, I think, at least from my perspective, and I suspect you might agree, that the recent proposal by US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about a minimum tax for multinational corporations, and we'll see how that proposal goes and so on, but it certainly seems like a step in that direction of trying to address the issue. I want to switch gears for a second and talk about female representation amongst high-income earners. You point out some figures in your book about how there's been some progress in France and the United States and some other countries, and it's true in Australia as well. There's been some increase of the proportion of women in the top 1%, maybe a little bit less in the top 0.1% of the uber elite, but that progress is very slow. And you do some calculations about what year women will reach parity, and it's long after you and I will be gone if it continues at the current rate. But the thing I found most interesting on this issue is that you talk about assortative mating and how when very highly educated men and women marry each other, this might make these matters worse. I wonder if there's a flip side to that coin where it could make things better. Could it be the case that elitely educated and economically powerful women might be more successful in changing the behaviours and changing the expectations of similarly powerful and privileged men? And that it's really these kind of, and I'm talking about heterosexual relationships here just as one example, that powerful women might be able to change the behaviour and expectations of powerful men.
Yes, well, I was not planning to, to tax couples with a similar level of education who marry together and to subsidize, social mixing in marriage. So it's what it is. I mean, it's not something that I want to encourage or discourage. But what I want to say is this. Clearly the 1950-1980 period was sort of the golden age of patriarchy in many ways, in the sense that there was really this model of, if you can afford it, even if you're a working class, male, try to have your, wife at home, care with the children. And so this was viewed as a sort of achievement, or at least this was presented by, lots of people. And to some extent, it was the dominant ideologies in many Western societies between 1950 and 1980. And the first point I want to make is that, we're just out of this, but we're not completely out of this, in the sense that if you look at the share of women in the total wage bill, it's still quite low, because sometimes we don't make this comparison. We say, okay, for the same occupation, same job, the wage gap is 15% or 10% or 20%. But in fact, this is really minimizing the reality of the problem, because of course women don't have access to the same job, even when they have the education, they have a lot of part-time jobs, they stop working more, etc. So if you look in the end at the share of women, the share of women in total labor is certainly at least 50% and probably more. If we look at all forms of labor, including domestic work and all forms of labor in general, their share in monetary reward to the labor, is going to be 30% in some countries, 30 to 40%. In France in 1980, it was still 20%, 20-25%. So we're still very far. So we're moving toward 50%, but we're still very far. And so it's an issue. It's not only the problem of accessing the top; it's also improving, wages in the bottom part of the distribution in jobs that are typically filled by female workers. Improving the possibility to access a full-time job. It's also changing the general spirit about work, and I think reducing working time, having more vacation. This is the long run, purpose and logic of history. So you don't want. I think there would be no point, to promote. Women acting like men in the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and not seeing their children and not seeing anybody apart from their corporate board, and that's not the purpose of life. So it's also changing the relation to time, to work, and that's all of this. Now, just to conclude on your specific question on, is it good, is it bad to have increased assortative mating? Well, let's say this, as we get out of the patriarchy and as women work as much as men, or gradually work as much as men, and move up in the wage distribution, this is certainly going to create, through the addition of too high wages or too low wages, a tendency for more monetary inequality than at the age of patriarchy. What this implies to me is that there's even more need for redistribution of income and wealth, for paying attention to the salary scale that we have. I think the salary scale are much too wide. The very top executive pay to me have no logic and do not correspond to an economic necessity at all. Bottom wages, in a number of situations should be increased. What we've seen with the pandemic, I don't know, in Australia you are in a better situation than in Europe, but what we've seen in Europe during the pandemic is you have lots of nurses in hospitals, care workers, who are very often women and who have very low wages, who are very badly paid, and hopefully this pandemic will help us realize that the value of work.
It's definitely shone a light, even here where we've managed the pandemic very well. But it's really shone a light on these frontline workers, as you say, often workers who are primary school teachers and people in emergency services. And in some of those professions, women are highly represented and poorly paid. And it does make us focus on what society really values. Related to that, some people argue that inequality has been driven by things like human capital and network externalities, and this idea of being able to, it's maybe not move capital, but leverage your human capital over an entire world economy. So people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg and the Google guys might be characterized as people who had very good ideas that could be leveraged very widely over a large part of the US economy, or even more broadly. And one might even have a less charitable view, but you could even say that hedge fund managers and their returns are sometimes based on their human capital that can be leveraged in a world of mobile financial capital. How much of a role do you think that human capital has to play in driving economic inequality?
Well, generally speaking, education is the key driver of economic prosperity and also of economic inequality. So, if we think, for instance, of U.S. Economic leadership during the 20th century, as I argue in my book, it was primarily human capital leadership and educational leadership, if you wish. So, in the 1950s. You had 80-90% of a generation going to high school in the US, whereas in Germany or France or Japan at the time it was 20 or 30%. And then there was a big catch-up, and since the 1980s, there's a sort of educational catch-up and also a productivity catch-up. But if you try to explain the economic leadership over time of different countries and why the US completely overtook the United Kingdom, in the first half of the 20th century and already at the end of the 19th century in terms of productivity, or Germany vis-à-vis Britain or whatever, education is really a key driver. Now, education is not only an issue of human capital at the very top. I think it's really broad-based education, and that's I think we should not exaggerate the importance of a few isolated genius who invent everything for the rest of the world. We have to keep cool about that. I think Bill Gates did not invent the computer by himself. There was lots of thousands and hundreds of thousands of researchers, fundamental research paid by public investment. We've been accumulated knowledge for centuries and centuries, and what we have in many cases is a privatization of knowledge. Some people are very skilled at putting their name on findings which are not theirs, which were made by lots of people. So this economic notion, this economic concept that we have of an individual marginal product, which will be really the pure individual contribution to world output, is a pure ideological construction, in the sense that all wealth creation is collective in nature, in the sense that if Pythagoras theorem had not been invented 2,500 years ago, so we invent notion of like private property and private income only because they can be useful notion, and they are useful notion to coordinate economic activity and individual actions. But we should keep in mind that these are social invention.
And the people like Bill Gates also stood on the shoulders of giants, as you kind of allude to, and sometimes publicly funded giants, as you also say.
And 100 billion dollars. Look, 10 years ago, the top billionaires had 30 or 40 billion dollars. Now they have 100 or 200. Should we wait for them to have 1,000 or 2,000 before we start wondering? To me, it's completely obvious that it's too much, and it's mostly, to answer your question about technology, I think it's mostly institution made. It's not. Okay, the technology, in some case, could have led, some people indeed to use their skills over a larger market. This can happen, but the huge variations that we see over time are driven by other factors, by the way we organize, the international financial systems, the international tax system, and this can be reversed.
In the little time we have remaining, I'd like to come to a couple of questions from audience members, as we've had many people write in. The first one comes from John Locke, not the philosopher, but an audience member, who asks, to what extent does taxation alone address the intra- and international inequality that is so pervasive and pernicious? Can progressive redistributive taxation and enforcement rebalance and reinvigorate economies? And what tax levels would you propose? I think you've already touched on this already, but a brief response to that question, if you can.
Yeah, taxation is important, but just as one tool among others. So, equal education is critical. More workers' rights in companies is critical. Public investment in research is very important. Now, progressive taxation, of course, is also central, both through progressive taxation of income, wealth and inherited wealth, and in the proposal I make about this in the book, I have tax rate going from 0 or a few percent for people who have income or wealth below average to 80-90% at the very, very top, because this is the experience that we have, the historical experience that we have is that when this was used in the past, in fact, this worked pretty well. Or that's what I'm trying to show in my book. And people can come with different evidence, but at least they should look at this historical experience, in particular in the United States between 1930 and 1980. And I think this could have been organized even better. This could have worked even better. But by and large, I think there's sufficient evidence today that we want to return to that kind of progressive taxation.
Great, thank you. I'll do one more audience question and then abuse my privilege as chair and ask something I'm particularly fascinated about. Jennifer Arapko, another audience member, and this is a theoretical question, so it's good you said you think of yourself as a social scientist, not just an economist. She asked about Karl Marx and Capital Volume 1 in particular. You seem to take the view that inequality is more due to public policy choices rather than tectonic economic forces. Do you think that historical materialism is a useful idea, or perhaps less so?
Well,
it's a big question useful. When I'm asking for a short answer, I understand.
Yeah. Well, at the conclusion of my book, I say, okay, the history of the world has been the history of the class struggle according to Karl Marx, and what I suggest as a change is to view the history of the world as a history of ideological struggle. What I mean by this is that, of course, class struggle is very important. The balance of power between economic interest is critical and plays a very big role in the stories that I describe in my book. But class position and economic interest do not fully determine one's ideology and one's views about the world. So, there are different possible ways to organize the property system, the political system. And, take an example, when the Bolshevik revolution happened in 1917, clearly the balance of power, allowed them to overthrow, the Tsarist regime and implement, the first proletarian state in history in the view of the, people who were in charge. Now, the problem is that, in fact, there were still many very complicated ideological issues that they had not solved. Should there be factions within the Bolshevik party? What would be the proper salary scale and the Soviet Union, and who is going to enforce it? What should be the role of trade unions? How do you organize relations between different nationalities within the Soviet Union? These are very complicated questions. Should we have cooperative property or should it be entirely state property? What's the role of workers in the governance of factories? These are complicated questions which are not fully determined by the fact that you're working class or a bourgeois or a capitalist. You have to think about that. So the materialist perspective on history, has some strengths, but it needs to be supplemented by a perspective, taking ideas and ideologies on how to reorganize the world after you've overthrown the system you don't like, certainly more seriously than what these people did, in effect.
I'll save my last question for when COVID is over and the international borders are open and you come and visit us in Sydney sometime. In the meantime, before I wrap up, thank you, Thomas Piketty, for a conversation that we were very lucky to have and I have thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and see you in Australia.
See you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Capital and Ideology. I'd like to thank Thomas for joining us tonight and would encourage everyone watching to read his new book. To hear about upcoming events and podcasts, please subscribe to the UNSW Centre for Ideas newsletter or visit centreForIdeas.com. Good night.